Today in our final segment, Bible Study with Democrats, we're going to go to an unlikely source for Christianity. We're going to Ethan Hawke and his daughter Maya Hawke, because they were just recently on Catholic Father Robert Barron's podcast, where they talked about grace, they talked about forgiveness, they talked about Flannery O'Connor, and the new movie that Maya and Ethan just made about Flannery O'Connor called Wildcat. Check it out.
I don't know what to do with it.
I don't know what to do with it.
I miss it, or I mess it up.
I've had friends like that. I've had moments in my own life where you momentarily get it.
Yeah.
You get that you're a part of something much bigger, and there's like a crack in this banal treadmill that we're all on, and all of a sudden you see it. And how to take what you just saw, felt in your bones. She has another great line I love, which is, faith is what you know to be true, even if you don't believe it. It's like your body sometimes knows something's true. You know there's a larger truth that your intellect can't quite grasp.
Yeah.
And she has that other great line that if you could understand God would be less than you.
Right. And that's right from St. Augustine. If you understand it, that's not God.
Yeah, because it's much, and so her search and her ability to put the search into art, that you then have to say, okay, wait, I have had moments of grace. Did I respond right? Did I know how to incorporate? And that's the great value of organized religion.
Now I want to show you guys that clip because I think it's really interesting. I think it's a high-level intelligent conversation, and I just kind of love that sort of thing. And I think that there is merit in what Ethan Hawke says especially, and a much deeper guy than I gave him credit for. But then there's also some merit in the things that his daughter says. Now, they're kind of, the things she says are very typical for a young girl her age, I'll just be honest and say. But needless to say, throughout the whole conversation, there's some very interesting things that they discuss, and I submit it to you for your own personal benefit. Now, the second thing I have to point out about this conversation is I'm also a little bit uneasy about where the conversation went. So we hear words discussed like grace, higher self, cross, and Jesus and Christ almost never. And I thought that was a little bit odd in a conversation with a Catholic priest. But maybe not when you're dealing with two Hollywood actors. But the problem with not bringing Jesus into the conversation, especially when you're talking about these very biblical and religious words, is that the conversation can become incredibly esoteric and can be incredibly disconnected from real life and what we actually do in a real world scenario. For instance, these individuals that live in Hollywood and are steeped in gender ideology and all sorts of other crazy ideas. What do those ideas that are socially acceptable, what happens to those ideas when they come into conflict with the biblical truths that they're trying to espouse here about being your higher self? So let me give you a for instance. In the movie Wildcat, Ethan Hawke has to film his daughter doing graphic sex scenes. New York Post just recently reported this, and Ethan had something to say about it. And quote, Ethan Hawke couldn't care less about directing daughter Maya in graphic sex scenes. Now, after hearing that, what are the chances, do you think, that Ethan Hawke espouses a biblical view of sexuality, or a biblical view of the sanctity of human life, holy matrimony, or what the higher self looks like? What happens when you have a desire for the higher self, but then the scripture or God tells you that the higher self looks like rejecting some of the ideas that are so prominent in Hollywood? Do you reject those ideas, or do you accept those ideas because you're afraid of the social consequences of them, or because just emotionally you have a predisposition to believe this and not that? Nonetheless, the question comes to the fore. When we use these religious words, they don't mean anything if we're not actually willing to put them to the test, the ultimate test of the what would Jesus do thing. So this goes back to the Auburn thing. I'm happy about what took place there, but we have to make sure we're cheering for the right things before we start blindly cheering. And that's the third point and the most important point. And this goes back to what it means to have a good society and what it means to have a society made up of good citizens. Because if we're going to have a good society, we have to have good citizens. And that pushes us to a conversation of what good actually is, of what objective moral values look like and where we get them from. All I'm saying at the end of the day is that if we're going to have a conversation about what a good society looks like, we must have a conversation about what good citizens look like. And we can't use just random good-sounding words like grace, higher self, and discipline, and suffering, and never root those things in a moral system, in a basis of belief that actually help us integrate these ideas into something practical, into something usable. And that's exactly what Christianity does. Now you're going to say, well, of course I expect that from you, Reed, but let's just be really clear. Agnosticism and atheism doesn't do that. At least Richard Dawkins was honest enough to say this, that the world is exactly as you would expect it to be. No good, no evil, just blind, pitiless indifference. Now, this is what you get with atheism. You get a world where God doesn't exist and there is no such thing as good or evil. There's just pitiless indifference. We're all just kind of random atoms bumping into each other, unfortunately. And the reality is that you're going to have to go beyond secular humanism, beyond atheism, beyond agnosticism to actually create a functional society. And our society was built upon these principles. I think you know that's true. So we have to go beyond the esoteric and we have to move into something more substantive, more deep. And here's why this really, really matters to all of us today. Because the secularization of Christianity will play a part in how our society functions. Now, let me give you an analogy of this. In the early 1900s, miners started bringing canaries into coal mines because the songbirds would make noise constantly until they died. If they killed over, it was because the fumes were becoming so toxic that it was a sign to the miners that you better get out before the same thing happens to you. Now, I use this analogy because I think Christianity in the American West is a canary in the coal mine. If Christianity goes the way of secularism, then it's a sign of what is eventually going to happen to society. Now, you may hate Christianity. You may have had a bad experience in church one time and now you're all butthurt about it. But please think about what it means that a holy faith can be disfigured by progressivism and what that might do to a society that was built upon those ideas. You may think that is a hint to the durability of the Christian faith, that it's weak or something and it can't take any of the pressure that we've given it as a society. But I'd rather argue that it's more an indication of how weak and passive the church has become. The silence of the church is deafening, and other voices have filled that silence. Other voices like this. You know, COVID restrictions are gone. BLM is mostly a joke to anyone paying attention, but please know there will be another crisis that pops up sooner rather than later. And you will have to ask yourself, what is my responsibility to keep tyranny at bay? What ethical, moral basis will fuel my understanding of what's going on in the world so that I can stand up before it's too late? Before that happens, you can act now. You can start using your social media to take a stand on the issues that matter most. You can start speaking to your friends and encouraging them to attend school board meetings. You can start hosting Bible studies in your workplace. You can even boycott something, anything. Of course, not this show, but anything. Seriously, you can stop making excuses for how you can't boycott everything, and you can finally find something to boycott and stick to it. I'd highly encourage Disney, because just watch what happens when you actually believe in something and then you put some practical effort behind that thing. It's actually really good for the soul. Another thing, you can quit criticizing the people who are taking a stand and realize they've been saving your butt and making the world a better place for your kids, if even in their own way, while you sit back and do little else to change it except point your finger at the people who are making a difference and watch TV. I speak so pointedly, not because I feel like I've done these things well or even at all, but because I yearn for this world to return to a sense of normalcy. I know the only hope for that is to have an honest national conversation on ethics and where they actually come from. Eventually, Jesus will come up in that conversation, I have no doubt. And because he was so right about everything, people will be forced to acknowledge that and then maybe even believe in him. And that will truly change our world. But you can also take some practical steps as well beyond that, and you can subscribe, like, and share this podcast with others, because that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for watching. Go with God.
So you just got done watching a small excerpt of a much larger episode. You can find the link to that full episode down below in the description of this video. So you definitely want to check that out, because if you like that clip, you'll like the much larger episode. And while you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and click that little bell to be notified when great new episodes of Indie Thinker come your way. Thanks for watching.